Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Management Consulting podcast series where we discuss the business of running a consulting firm. So, in today's episode, I want to talk about probably the root behind the creation of most boutique firms, even offices of larger firms, right? It's usually if, for example, KPMG wants to open up an office in a new territory, it's going to bring in a consultant who has either worked at KPMG or a consultant who has expertise in that local region from a rival firm. If you're launching your own business, the odds are very high you have already worked at a Deloitte, a McKinsey, Accenture, even at a tech firm. In fact, you've worked somewhere and you bring those skills into your new organization. And what we want to talk about today is one of the biggest challenges, I think, you're going to face if that is the way your business is created. And the reason why is because usually when you set up your business this way, you are taking an idea, concept, toolkit, or some kind of intellectual property, but it's usually a set of frameworks, a very narrow set, and you are going to be repurposing it for your new role. And that's basically the way all consulting firms are founded. Now, people don't like to sometimes admit that is the root of their firm, whereby they've been exposed to a toolkit, a framework, they feel they know enough about it, they feel there's a market for it, they feel they can then take it with them when they start their own firm. But that's the reality of how most firms are founded. Every firm is founded this way, whereby the founders learn a set of skills and they feel that that narrow set of skills can be the foundation of a new firm. But there are problems here. And what I want to talk about are the very real problems if this is the sole source of value in your consulting firm. So let's just step back for a second here, right? And think about this. Whether we like to admit it or not, and most times we don't admit it, every single firm when it's founded, or every single person interested in management consulting, you have to go out there and you have to look at books like, or journals like the Harvard Business Review, McKinsey Quarterly. I mean, I'm sure people use our websites, many of them do. But you go to a number of usual places that you learn about strategy. So for example, if you wanted to learn about how to do let's say a corporate finance strategy study, where would you go to learn that? Well, you would go to most likely the McKinsey Quarterly, or read the book on valuation, or whatever the other major books are on valuation, and you would hope to be exposed to a framework or an approach. Now, here's the thing you have to understand. When information or publications are written about strategy, there are two audiences. The first audience are executives. People that run Ford, Google, AT&T, name the company, right? Whether in the United States or outside. But there are two audiences. The first one are executives. And executives are not interested in how to develop a framework. They're not interested in how the study is structured. They're not interested in the thinking that goes into the development of the approach. All they're interested in is, okay, if I'm an executive, I'm not a strategy partner, I'm an executive, how do I make this decision? How do I think about the issues in my industry? So a lot of strategy publications cater to this audience. Now, the other audience are strategy practitioners. Those are the people that put together the analysis and the thinking that serves a client executive. So you got two audiences. Again, the first audience are people that are the primary clients, and they're not interested in why things happen the way they happen. They just want to see the overall final picture. And then the other audience are strategy practitioners, and those are people who need to know how to develop a framework to help AT&T reduce expenses for the capital, because capital needs to roll out a new network, right? Now, the big gist I'm making, or the big point I'm trying to make is that a lot of the things you read about strategy, if you're a strategy practitioner, aka strategy consultant, is not designed for you. When McKinsey is putting out the McKinsey Quarterly, it's not trying to advise other consultants on how to develop new ways of thinking and develop new frameworks and develop new ways to solve a problem. It doesn't obviously care about you. In fact, it's trying everything in its power not to educate you to do that, because then you become a competitor to McKinsey. So McKinsey's audience are executives, and the material it puts out are things about how those executives can understand some important insights to manage their business, but it's not explaining to the executive, okay, if you're in the telecom sector, how do you go about figuring out the problem you have? How do you go about constructing the framework to solve the problem? It's not going to teach them that, because that executive group doesn't care about that. And McKinsey obviously doesn't want to train people to do that. Neither does Bain, neither does BCG. Neither does the Harvard Business Review. Although to some degree, I think the Harvard Business Review, maybe 10% of the articles does concentrate on that category, but it's a very tiny group. And I would say it's shrinking as well. So when you are a strategy practitioner and you go to all these sources, you got to understand that they're not talking to you. But a lot of people assume that, well, the McKinsey Quarterly said to do it this way, but the McKinsey Quarterly's audience is not a strategy practitioner. It's the end user of whatever the engagement is, right? So as you are learning how to do things, remember that, and this is the kicker, as a strategy practitioner, your job is not to memorize frameworks. All those frameworks put out in McKinsey Quarterly, put out in the Harvard Business Review, they're for executives to use. Your job as a strategy practitioner is to figure out how to develop a framework. We have lots of clients in MBA programs, but even today, the most sophisticated MBA programs in strategy in the world today, they teach you a framework. They'll teach you the Porter's framework, they'll teach you a corporate finance framework, they'll teach you a corporate strategy framework. I have colleagues who are ex-partners at McKinsey and so on, and I know the programs they teach at major MBA schools. And what do they teach? They teach a framework. But as a strategy thinker, your job is not to go out there and source all the frameworks in the world. Your job is to figure out how to develop a framework. If you go into a telecoms client, you've got to ask yourself, hey, how do I develop this framework to solve this problem? And it's a very hard skill to do. That's the point here. It's very hard to do this. I mean, I always train people, you've got to look at frameworks. Now, for insiders, our loyalty members who are thinking about, okay, this makes sense, which it should, if you want to play the long game, how do I learn how to develop these frameworks? There's two ways to do it. One is go look at what we teach in TCO around brainstorming. We teach you how to develop structures, which are frameworks. The other two areas where you can learn this is in the, we have a program called a McKinsey BCG typical engagements, about 270 videos. Insiders can go to the beginning of that study. My favorite one is the corporate strategy and turnaround study, whereby if insiders go to the beginning of that study and see how we structure the problem, the reason I like that is because in the corporate strategy and turnaround study, there is no clear objective function. There's no clear problem statement. There's nothing you are maximizing. So it's a much harder problem statement to develop. And then when you have your problem statement and you build out the way you're going to solve it, that becomes your structure, which is a fancy word for saying framework, right? So if you want to learn how to develop those things, that's where you got to go to do it. Now, as I mentioned before, developing frameworks is very hard. I know many partners, obviously, and what I've noticed is because it's so hard to develop frameworks, over time, they develop a framework and then they just stick to it forever. That means every single client they go to, every single client, and I've seen them do it, they have this framework which they've spent their whole lives thinking about, and they use that framework to solve every problem. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, for example, if you have a way of thinking about shareholder value creation, yeah, you should take it to every client, but it shouldn't be the only thing you take to every client because shareholder value creation is a big field. You have to manage assets. Within assets, you need a way of thinking about how to maximize returns on those assets. You would need to develop another framework. But because every client is so different and because every issue is so nuanced, you should be thinking about a new framework. Now, if you look at the latest work we do around market entry strategy, you would see that our thinking on market entry strategy is radically different from anything anyone else has out there. And when we explain to people, it makes perfect sense to them. But the gist of that is that the first rule of market entry strategy is not to consider entering a market. And when we teach that to people, they don't really see how that makes sense until we explain to them, right? And again, insiders will have access to this probably in season 3 and 4 of the consulting offer. Now, if you want access to some of these things for a limited time only, if you go to firmsconsulting.com, that's firmsconsulting.com, and you register for free on the website, you will get an advanced preview of the material of our advanced videos that we use to teach insiders, right? But I'm also going to teach you some concepts here. Now, I've seen this often. I've known many people who have left consulting firms at various levels. One of the primary reasons they leave is that they have an idea that they've been exposed to at the consulting firm. They've used it at a client on an engagement or a series of engagements, and they love the idea. They think there's a market for the idea and they can take it to a client. And they love the idea so much that when they take the idea to the client, they're evangelizing the idea. They think so highly of it that clients listen just because the consultant is so captivated to the idea. But here's the thing you're going to face. Over time, if you are still repeating the same idea to clients, even if the idea is new to a client, the idea is not going to be new to you. You know the idea is getting old. You know your original employer is coming out with new ways of thinking. Even if the client doesn't know your idea is old, you're aware that your idea has a sell-by date. So whether or not you like it or not, a couple of things will happen. You develop idea fatigue. You're so used to repeating this whole song and dance about this framework and structure and approach to solving a problem that you go into a mechanized approach whereby you just talk through it, not because you're excited or because you're following what the client is saying, but because you have an elevator pitch. When you have an elevator pitch, you always have less enthusiasm and you need to dress up the idea. So over time, when you take the approach to 50 clients, you think that, well, taking it to 50 clients, at least 12 of them have mentioned things I can do differently. So you start expanding the idea. Even though the idea may make perfect sense and still be valuable, you will develop fatigue. You will go through the motions. You will start dressing it up because in your mind, the idea doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. Or at least it's tired. And then time continues, right? The idea becomes old. It's now officially old. You have no new ideas. Why? Because you never learned how to develop frameworks. Your entire model of being a consultant is to go find a framework and then show it to a client and get paid for it. Now, as an aside here, I would encourage everyone following this series and any of our programs for that matter. A good consultant doesn't just sell a framework to a client. A good consultant is focused on making sure the client is better off than when they first arrived at their client. So just because you have a new framework that you don't fully understand and don't know how to use properly doesn't mean you're adding any value to a client. And that's the thing that scares me a lot of times, because we get a lot of emails from people asking us for frameworks. And I understand they're under pressure, they want to use a framework, but what if you have a framework? I mean, how many people have the Porter's 5 Forces framework? I mean, I think we can all agree that Michael Porter is a seriously smart guy who probably spent a lot of time thinking through that framework. It's a well thought out framework. But have you ever, now I've never seen a strategy developed on the Porter's 5 Forces framework, mainly because people don't know how to use it. Same with the profitability framework, probably the most well-known framework in the world. Most people don't know how to use a profitability framework. So if you go through life just amassing frameworks, you're going to be a little bit smart by showing clients a new framework, but you're not going to develop anything good from it. The job of a consultant is not to have a good framework that they misuse, but it's to have an okay framework that generates a good solution for a client. So focus less on having the best framework and doing more with the framework you do have, right? But anyway, coming back into this, the idea becomes old. You have no new ideas because you have not fully or at all developed the thinking to develop new frameworks. So you can't really do much. You're stuck with the framework you have. You left the firm. You can't get access to new frameworks. So you double down on the framework, aka the type of business you have. And I've seen this many times whereby a procurement consultant has his procurement approach. I was looking at something developed by a pharmaceutical pricing consultant from McKinsey a few days ago. And he's got this very detailed approach, but that's all he has. And because it's the only thing he knows, every single problem he sees in pharmaceuticals is related to his framework. It doesn't matter if it's not related. He'll bring it all back there. And that's the danger you face when you haven't built the skill to develop frameworks. You are forced to use the frameworks that are given to you. And if a client problem arises that it could be very lucrative, very exciting, but you don't have the ability to build an approach to solve it, you will default to the frameworks you already have and therefore force everything into that solution. Now, as you get older, in consulting, we age much faster, so 2 years is older. Hard to develop new ideas. And what I've seen here is that older consultants who haven't developed the approach to develop frameworks and new ways of thinking, they, again, double down on the idea and they develop methodologies around it. So rather than saying, you know what, I should not be wedded to frameworks, I should approach every problem as new and build a framework around it. No, they will take that framework that they took from the firm, that the only one they know, and they'll start building in detailed steps behind it. And they'll go to clients saying, this is my approach and these are the detailed steps. We know exactly what we're doing. They'll then make themselves an expert in the idea. They may trademark the framework. They'll start saying, okay, my name is Malcolm Peterson, who is the founder of the Advanced Procurement Optimization Methodology registered trademark. And that's what happens. I mean, you see it all the time in industry. If you ever want to know how these things develop, this is how it develops. It develops with good intentions, but bad underlying problem-solving skills. And I'm going to say this happens to all firms. Even firms founded by ex-McKinsey partners. I've seen it with a lot of them. How many ex-McKinsey partners have founded thriving boutique firms? Think about it. How many of them have founded thriving boutique firms that have lasted more than 5 years, let alone 10 years? I personally only know of one. They all have given up. It's not because they're not smart. Two things happen to them. One is you get lazy. Developing a new customized approach to solve every problem takes up a lot of brain power. Nobody wants to do that. If you look at the work we put out, everything is customized. And I can assure you it's a lot of hard work to do that. But my thinking is that you only live on the earth once. Reincarnation may be a thing, but it hasn't been proven. And until I'm guaranteed that it's a thing, I need to make do with the time I have to the best of my abilities. I need to make sure every client engagement has the best approach. So for example, if you are an MBA student or you're starting your own firm and you've been taught that strategy is a set of frameworks, remember that is the strategy for an audience that are executives. They're interested in frameworks. If you're a strategy practitioner or consulting practitioner, you need to start developing frameworks and approaches, not memorizing them and collecting them like, Teletubbies or something like that. So here's a self-assessment for you, right? When you are talking to clients, ask yourself this, or say it out this way. I will focus on a problem versus an approach because, so now I've explained to you why you'll focus on the problem versus the approach. The approach is the framework. You don't focus on a framework because if you only focus on frameworks and never focus on the problem, you never learn how to build a framework to solve the problem. You always focus on the problem and then you develop an approach to solve the problem, which becomes your framework. If you focus on the approach, all you're doing is looking for the right framework, but you are going to face a lot of problems and this happens all the time, when you face a problem to which the framework you're using is incorrect. I use the market entry strategy as an example of that because it's a classic example where everyone is really taken aback when they see why a very, very conventional framework is actually wrong for market entry. So how will you explain it, right? This is important to you, the client. You've got to explain to the client because clients always see frameworks. You've got to be able to explain to a client why you're not going in with the framework. Or, now let's assume that you have a framework that is perfect for the client. In that case, yes, use it. But a lot of times what you find is the framework the client wants is not correct because they have not assessed their problem correctly. If the problem statement changes, the approach to solve the problem will change. If the approach changes, the framework will change because the framework is the approach. So you've got to get comfortable explaining to a client why in certain situations you are not using a traditional framework, but you need to develop a new way to solve the problem. If you get comfortable having that discussion, how will you lower resistance to this? Well, I'll talk about it more later, but basically you lower resistance by offering them a chance to see how you would do this for free, basically. And I'll show you how this is done in a few more episodes. But when I say free, I don't mean working for free completely. But I've done it when I was at the firm and we charge hundreds of thousands of dollars, millions of dollars. There are times when you do free work. You have to do it strategically, and I'll talk you through that. And then again, always avoid the urge to build long presentations. People always fall for this trap, whereby they think that things will just be easier if they can have some long, detailed presentation to support their thinking and talking. It never works that way. It's just going to slow you down and never teach you how to talk to clients. Now, if you've listened to anything here that maybe you're interested in more information, you'd like it elaborated on and so on, what I would recommend is write a comment because we use the comments to guide future episodes. So tell me what you liked so I know what to keep. So tell me what are the things you liked about the episode and also questions that you want answered in future episodes, put it in and we'll build it into future episodes. As always, I look forward to speaking to you in the next episode.